Good evening, and thanks so much for joining us for what's going to be an incredibly enriching conversation. I'd now like to welcome our Dean, Dean Tony Varona, Dean of the University of Miami Law School, for the introductions. Dean Varona.
Thank you so much, Dean Levy. My name is Tony Varona, and I have the honor of being the Dean of the University of Miami School of Law. It is my great privilege to welcome you to this fireside chat. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope that you are all well. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to those who helped organize this very important event. In particular, I want to thank Associate Dean for Law, Academic and Student Services and Strategic Initiatives and the Director of our Entertainment, Arts and Sports Law LLM, Greg Levy, for his hard work in putting together this important event. It is my distinct honor today to introduce our two distinguished speakers, Jim Rooney and Professor Jeremi Duru. Jim Rooney, Dan Rooney's son, is a business owner, a co-partner of Rooney Consulting, facilitator, national speaker, and the author of A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. His recently published book details his father's long and successful career in sports, business, and philanthropy. The book quickly became an Amazon bestseller and was listed on President Obama's 2019 favorite book list. Professor Jeremi Duru is a professor of law at the American University Washington College of Law, where he teaches sports law, civil procedure, and employment discrimination, and where his students adore him and his faculty colleagues adore him. He is considered one of the nation's most knowledgeable sports law authorities and was also a collaborator on the book. Jeremi is a friend and former colleague of mine at American, and I'm just delighted to welcome you here too, Jeremi.
Thank you.
Together over the last few months, Jim and Jeremi have engaged in conversations on the Rooney Rule at universities like ours, on podcasts, and on other media outlets. Today's discussion will focus on the Rooney Rule and examine the legal and ethical obligations of lawyers and executives to consider diverse candidates in hiring for management and leadership positions. This conversation promises to be an enriching one, and I am very much looking forward to hearing from our distinguished speakers as well as our wonderful moderator, Associate Dean Osamudia James, who will help frame our discussion today. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and I now turn the virtual podium over to you, Associate Dean James.
Thank you so much, Dean Varona, and thank you, Jeremi and Jim, for joining us today. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you. I want to welcome our attendees and also say that if you have questions that you'd like to ask, just please go ahead and put those in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them towards the end of the conversation after we've heard from our two guests today. So, I want to talk a little bit about what the Rooney Rule is meant to do. And to do that, I want to frame a little bit about the context in which the Rooney Rule is currently operating. So 59% of NFL league players are Black, 70% of them are non-white. In 2019, about less than 13%, 12.5% of regular season NFL games were coached by people of color. And that's down from a high watermark of 27% in 2011. In terms of management, two teams now, only two employ minority general managers. There are two Black offensive coordinators, which is key because that tends to be a pipeline for head coaching positions. There are only two Black owners, and 11 front office executives are of color. And in terms of a pool or a pipeline, white assistant coaches are 114% more likely to be promoted to coordinator level than Black coaches managing the same position. So help us understand what the Rooney Rule is doing or attempting to do in a climate like that at the NFL.
Jeremy, do you want to start?
Sure. So first of all, thanks so much, Dean James, for having me and having Jim. This is fantastic. And it's a great question. And so the numbers that you just ran through are relatively bleak, and the disproportionality is substantial. You identified 70% of the players being non-white, but the number of coaches in the league, general managers in the league, those numbers are almost entirely white. And so the question is, what can the Rooney Rule do? Well, so the Rooney Rule, the rule basically says that if you are going to get a head coach or a general manager, you're going to hire one of these, for one of these positions, you have to interview at least one person of color. The numbers you just cited in my view, are the consequence of that rule not operating the way it should. So the rule was first put in play in 2003. And in the 7 or 8 years after the rule was put in play, the numbers, which then were worse than they are now, got much, much better. We had 8 head coaches of color in the league, 8 general managers of color in the league. And then you started to see it taper off. And I think part of the tapering off has to do with a number of things. One thing it has to do with is the passing of Jim's father, Dan Rooney, who works very hard from the inside of the league to make sure that teams follow the rule. The retirement of a gentleman named John Wooten, who's the chairperson of the Fritz Pollard Alliance, which is an outside advocacy group for people of color in the National Football League. So Jim's father passed away and John retired within a year from each. So now we've got 2 leaders on the issue who are no longer engaged, and both of them have huge shoes to fill. It's tough to fill those. But in addition to that, there was a real, I would say, the rule was not effectuated over the last few years the way it was early on. So a few years ago, the Oakland Raiders had a head coach opening, and they ended up hiring John Gruden, who by any assessment is a good coach, but also by pretty much any assessment, they did not follow the rule. They flouted the rule, and other clubs saw that. In my view, clubs from that time have taken the rule less seriously, and so we've seen what was once a very, very important innovation kind of be backburnered by the league in a way that I think has resulted in some of the numbers we have here. This past spring, 2020, the league, in my view, recognizing that it had not really been, had fidelity to the rule, has strengthened it in a few ways. Now you have to interview 2 people of color for a head coaching position and general manager positions. Now you have to interview people of color for offensive coordinator positions, which you mentioned, Associate Dean James, and for defensive coordinator positions and for special teams coordinator positions. And there have been some other, some more robustness that's been wrapped around the rule. So hopefully we will start to see an increase in the number of candidates of color who are being interviewed and getting jobs that might match or surpass what we saw in the early 2000s.
I want to come back to this idea of accountability and how we sort of get to accountability in a league that essentially governs itself. But before then, Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about your father's legacy and how he saw the Rooney Rule as part of a larger constellation of structural initiatives and efforts to try to diversify leadership in the league?
Right. And you know, as Jeremy said, it's wonderful to be with you, Dean Varona, Dean Levy. Thank you for having us. So I think this answer should lead naturally to your question about accountability. You know, what my father did in so many ways is create culture, create a culture within the Steelers organization, which was his primary leadership role, but then lend in a whole host of places, the National Football League, his work that he did in Ireland throughout his life, sort of create or influence cultures in a way that really, you know, did this fundamental thing of creating a sense of belonging, and that belonging was part of the accountability. So when you look at the Steelers of the 1970s, or prior to the 1970s, sort of when my father took over management, one, he had in his business plan for the team, you know, he had, I want the Steelers to be one of the most highly integrated teams in sports. So he was definitive in his plan. He hired a gentleman named John Wooten, who was, he didn't hire John Wooten, he partnered with John Wooten. He hired a gentleman named Bill Nunn, who was another one of the first African-American scouts in NFL history. Bill is up for the Hall of Fame this year, and it's the first time an African-American has been in the contributor category. And Bill had been a sports writer and had put together an all-star list of players from mainly HBCUs, but there were several schools that weren't considered HBCUs that were bringing Black athletes onto their team at a time when there was segregation, particularly in the South, from folks having these opportunities. And so Bill, and so they have this conversation, and Bill was very critical of the Steelers. And he said, you know, you're just not doing a good enough job. You say this is something you want to do, and I almost believe you, but you're not executing. And so so my father hires Bill on the spot in this confrontational meeting. And I think what was really important about that is and we can talk about that in the Rooney Rule, because he did some similar things with John Wooten and some other folks, where he was always willing to bring in opinions that were different than his own, and oftentimes challenged him in a really significant way. And you know, we talk about that, but there were core examples throughout my father's life of actually being in hard, messy conversations and having outcomes that you wouldn't expect and were changed from his point of view going in. And then the third thing with the Steelers is, so he brings Bill Nunn in, they have, you know, he has it in the business plan, he brings him in, all that's nice. With Bill, with Coach Knoll, with my Uncle Art, with the whole system, we draft more players from the HBCUs from 1968 to 80. That team goes on to win 4 Super Bowl championships in 6 years. So we create this competitive advantage by going to this pool of talent. The other thing, you had the first time in NFL history, and I'm not just doing this to pat myself on the back. Or my father on the back. There's a point to this. The first African-American quarterback to ever be named prior to a season beginning, Joe Gilliam, was named by Coach Knoll in '74. You had the first 3 offense, defense, and special teams, which are your captains of a black captains of a Super Bowl championship team. And then it is the training grounds for Tony Dungy, who goes on to be the first African-American to win a Super Bowl. And what that environment did was, because it was genuine and authentic, I believe, that leadership naturally arose. And my father saw and benefited from the effectiveness of that leadership. It wasn't just Bill Nunn. It was an entire culture that allowed folks to be themselves, to feel that merit was going to be the decision, not race was going to be the basis of decisions, and leadership naturally emerged. So creating those cultures, and we can talk about them as we go forward in the Rooney Rule, but that to me is such a good case study of how we get what accountability can look like.
So, you know, you mentioned Tony Dungy, and I was reading his remarks, and he was saying that, look, you can't really legislate change, right? You have to sort of show the owners that this sort of change is good for them. But I want to get into your thoughts about what you need to do in addition to the Rooney Rule to sort of change cultures in a way that's not legislating, if that's not possible. I'm thinking, for example, of Eric Bieniemy, right? One of 2 minority offensive coaches, helps the Chiefs win a Super Bowl, interviews for 3 jobs, doesn't get them, including one with the Carolina Panthers, who goes on to hire someone with no NFL experience, right? And there's a sense that owners have someone in mind already, and that this is sort of a checking of the box. And so, you know, the rule can only get you so far. So talk to me a little bit more about how you, in fact, change culture and convince owners that it is in their interest to have more diversity. I'm not sure the incentives actually align to show them that it does.
Well, you know, we could make an argument that the Steelers case certainly does demonstrate that. We've been, you know, we now have Mike Tomlin as the longest serving, most successful African-American coach in NFL history. Even with the hiring of Coach Cowher, Joe Green was in the final 3 candidates. So my father was really running the Rooney Rule before the Rooney Rule existed. And I say that because there are examples. So you know, I'm not trying to dismiss what you're saying, because I do think that unfortunately there's a lot more examples of the opposite than what my father did. But we've been, other than teams for a decade here, a decade there, we've been more successful than all those teams. Since the 1970s, Steelers have won more games, more championships, sent more players to the Hall of Fame. You know, every metric of success, we have outperformed the rest of the National Football League for the last 50 years. So, you know, I'm a little biased, but that to me is an example. Why it doesn't happen, I can't quite answer that. I will say that the Bieniemy situation is so painful to watch, because there is no question in my mind, if he were a white man, he'd be a head coach, you know, plain and simple. Because if you look at the performance that he had, I'm not answering your question, but I just think this is such an important point. If you look at the performance he had at the most critical point of a season, the playoffs, and then ultimately the Super Bowl, which was down in Miami, each time the offense was down by 10 points. So it wasn't a defensive issue. It was his unit. that came back. I think it was the first time in NFL history, it's certainly the first time in recent history, that in 3 games, you were down by 10 points, the team comes back and wins. And then when you, I don't want to get too into football here. We're with lawyers. I'll let you guys get into your technical stuff. But if you look at the third and fourth quarter of that Super Bowl game, it was one of the most magnificent uses of talent, and then using talent as decoys, because they have Patrick Mahomes, who I think is the best player in the NFL right now. They have 2 great receivers, and they ran the ball the whole time. And that's a set of strategies and the deployment of tactics with those strategies to do that. And that's all Eric Bieniemy. So that situation, I think, really exemplifies the nature of your question. I don't know that I can give you a better answer than the Steelers as an example, but there's no question in my mind that something is missing when you look at the Eric Bieniemy situation.
Jeremy, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I'll say, a couple of things. That's right, man. The Steelers, there's no question that in this regard, the Steelers and maybe 1 or 2 other clubs are clubs that do seem to be accepting this concept that pursuing diversity will actually make us better. And it's a concept, I don't want to go deep into con law, but, I was thinking back about the Gritter and Gratz cases out of University of Michigan, the affirmative action cases there. And Justice O'Connor, ultimately the court came out, upheld those affirmative action policies that spoke to diversity. And Justice O'Connor, in the opinion, talked about the extent to which military leaders and corporate leaders spoke to how much better they were. They wanted diverse workforces. They wanted a set of diverse people. And then Justice O'Connor said, well, so it's important for us as we educate our students to have diversity. And since then, there have been numerous studies that have spoken to the import of diversity, the extent to which diversity actually increases the bottom line, improves decision-making, problem solving. And so it's frustrating when you don't see that some organizations throughout the country and world, but certainly in the National Football League, don't seem to be accepting that. You mentioned Carolina. During the course of the process of the hiring of the current head coach, I remember the owner was quoted saying something like, this candidate who ended up getting the job just reminds me of myself, And that's frustrating for candidates of color in a world where the owners of 31 out of 32 teams are white. And often when people think about this person reminds me of myself, they're thinking about that sort of familiarity. And so the key is nudging people or wrenching people away from that idea of, oh, that person reminds me of myself, or, oh, that's the person I want to hire, and getting them to understand you will be giving yourself a competitive advantage if you don't have that knee-jerk reaction, and you take your time and you're deliberate and you think about diversity intentionally when you do your hiring.
This reminds me of even the comment that the Giants coach made about Joe Judge. I think he said there's just a certain something about him, right? Even though he had not had sort of experience you might want as a head coach, and trying to get people to understand that unwittingly, even if they don't intend it, that is sort of code for this person seems familiar to me, or they seem like me, right? And so then where's the space? How do you have those conversations in the NFL, right? The Rooney Rule is sort of one thing to do, a policy to adopt. But where is the space in the NFL for that conversation about, do you know what it is you're doing when you say this person reminds you of myself? And how does this play out in in a league in which the owners govern themselves, right? And that the commissioner has not been using that bully pulpit to really push this issue forward.
Go ahead, Jim.
Okay. Another fantastic question. So, I think that it has to do with a shift we're living in throughout society right now. And the players standing up in March and saying, they put the video out and mentioned George Floyd, and then all the other names of the victims of, police brutality, violence. That was so powerful. It got Roger Goodell, who I think has always had interest, but you know, I think that was such a pivotal push, and you know, that's the world we live in now, and I think it's a good thing in so many ways because a younger generation has a voice that they use in a way that I you know, certainly I'm in my mid 50s. When I was in my 20s, I don't know that I would have used my voice in the same way. So I think that as simple as that may sound, I think that's important. I think that the fact that the players now have that self permission. I don't know what the best word is, but they took that initiative on themselves and said, you know, this is something that's unacceptable to us, and this conversation needs to change. So I think that's important. You know, the reality is the league meetings are most of the executives and owners, and so you're going to have a group of people who are mainly white in those conversations, and so I think one of the good things that has happened with the Rooney Rule most recently is not the coaching or football side, because there has been a pretty solid movement. We can talk about, and rightfully so, the limitations at the head coaching position. But, you know, since the Rooney Rule, you now have 40% of the assistant coaches are African American. So you have the football operation side of a business. There's a high degree of integration. In the rest of the business, you're not there. And there is now a Rooney Rule requirement for vice president, president jobs at the level of, you know, at communications, finance, whatever those are. Those folks then will be engaged in these conversations in the off season, which is where these types of conversations happen. And that, you know, I think there's a long road there, but that is, I think, a transformational point. I think that once you get off the field and into the business decision-making environment, if we can create greater diversity there, I think that there will be a chance for that to have a greater impact, you know, around the entire system.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, for a long time, a lot of us outside of the league have been pushing the league to expand the Rooney Rule to the business side, away from just the football ops side to the business side. And so we saw that this past spring, and I agree with Jim. I'm hoping that will be that will yield some benefits. But in addition, you asked earlier, Associate Dean James, about other approaches that we can add to the mix in terms of trying to push for equal opportunity and diversity, as well as ways to try to shake people out of just going toward what's familiar. And one proposal that I've really championed and pushed for, that the league did not adopt, but I think should, is, and there are some logistical issues with it, but is delaying all hirings for a certain period of time after the regular season. So right now, after the regular season ends, on the Monday after the last Sunday of games, people get fired. A bunch of people get fired. A few have gotten fired earlier in the season, but you'll have 4 or 5 firings that day. And then within 7, 10, 14 days, all the hirings take place. And they take place because, for other reasons, clubs are afraid that this coach they want is going to get snapped up and this one they want is going to get snapped up. And there's a huge amount of pressure to get the hiring done. And so now going back to your question about familiarity, when we're under pressure, when we're under time constraints, we go to what's familiar. All the sociologists will tell us that. I mean, you go to what's familiar. And so if we put if these owners find themselves under, let me say, time constraints, you're going to more likely find them going to what's familiar. But if there were to be some sort of hiring hiatus, moratorium, from the end of the regular season till after the Super Bowl, you've now got 6-7 weeks to really take your time, both to implement the Rooney Rule properly, but also to think more generally about casting a wide net. Think about pools you may not have gone to before. Take yourself beyond just the offensive coordinators who you've been thinking about. Look into the college ranks, look into other ranks. If we give owners time to do that, I think it's more likely we'll get them to see that there is something in it for them by going outside of the normal pools of interviewees.
Would you comment on the suggestion that maybe teams should have their draft status, their draft selection status elevated if they do a good job through minority hiring? I understand that that suggestion was tabled, right, for a discussion. But that seems to me to have real bite and creates real accountability and incentives for the sort of process we want to see. What are your thoughts about that?
Let me jump first because really there's an experience that you both can share with me that I can't share because it's where this got tabled is so the idea came up when the analysis of where should we go. It's okay when you look at transformational change, if you look at change management that really is effective, having teeth is good in the short term, and it's good to have some mechanism that says if you do this wrong, there's going to be a penalty. That's good sort of in a one-off case. But really, when you look at transformational change, positive incentives demonstrate that the change lasts longer, and usually people invest in making the change in a deeper and more effective way. And there's nothing teams want more than either more draft picks or better draft picks. So that occurs, and this proposal's out there, and then rightfully, and we can go to this other the sort of Bill Nunn question. The thing my father did, which was when he was involved in these decisions, he always had partners with him who had experiences that were different than his own. But this comes out in the springtime, and several folks said, that's demeaning, that's humiliating, that's discounting the fact of that there are minority coaches who are every bit as qualified, and you shouldn't have to incentivize someone to do that. So it got into sort of the theory of change management versus this really meaningful discussion that, again, I can't have the experience that you folks have to say, Jim, that's humiliating to me. So it got tabled because I think the conversation we have right now is part of it. Do you make a decision that says, well, it's going to be a little bit humiliating, but it's going to affect the change? Is there another way to look at it that we're not seeing? All of those are part of it, but fundamentally, the idea came from the notion that, okay, let's look at change management and what makes change management initiatives more effective.
I have thoughts about this, but Jeremi, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I'll say it was interesting when that, excuse me, when that proposal came out. I remember, I think it came out on a Thursday or Friday, and I think the owners' meeting was the following Tuesday. And it came out, and it was attacked from the right for sure as unfair, and these clubs would get these benefits for benefiting people of color, and the right came out hard against it, which I think the league anticipated. But I don't know that they anticipated the concerns of some of the coaches and assistant coaches who expressed a concern that this is going to be stigmatizing for me and is humiliating or potentially humiliating. And I think the combination of the attack on the right and the concern from those coaches led the league to pull it back before essentially pull it back. And I think by that time they knew it would be tabled on the Tuesday. But it's also important to know to note that there was another group of assistant coaches of color who had a different view. And their view was something's got to be done. Everything that's being done thus far is failing. We have to get more aggressive. And if this is more aggressive and this is what it means, and if it means that there may be some stigma with this, then let's do it. And let me go and just, be twice as good and prove everybody wrong. So there was also that view. And I should point out that, that same concern has been expressed by assistant coaches and lower level front office executives about the Rooney Rule. The concern that, me having to sit for this interview where I may not be seriously considered, is humiliating. And in that realm as well, there's some people who feel like they don't want to go to the interviews, understandably, because they feel that'll be the consequence. And there are other people who feel like I'm going to take the interview, and it's not fair, just like the rest of, living in this country as a person of color is not fair. And systemic racism courses through all of it, but I'm going to go and do the interview, and I'm going to be twice as good. And I remember Ron Rivera, coach of the Washington football team, I think he must have had 7 or 8 interviews before he became a head coach of the Carolina Panthers. And he was interviewed once. And I think the interviewer said, well, you did all these interviews, some of which you knew probably weren't legitimate interviews. And he said, you know what, I took them all and I ultimately got the job I wanted. And I think if you were to ask him, he would say that it stunk, but I'm happy I endured that to get to where I am. And so, I don't know at the end of the day whether that view articulated by some of the assistant coaches with respect to the draft proposal should have carried the day. We just know that ultimately it didn't. And all of the assistant coaches of color who have different views on it, their views are respectable either way. But those who I think would have wanted the proposal to go through just ended up losing out on it.
I'll say 2 things about that. One is that we often hear this argument also in the context of higher ed, affirmative action, and all, looking at studies like Shape of the River, Source of the River. These are longitudinal studies that interview students who believe that they were beneficiaries of affirmative action. And over the long term, they generally say that's fine with me, right? Because it opened up a door and gave me access, right? Affirmative action might be able to get me through the door, but it can't keep me here. And in terms of what it does, in terms of being able to open doors for others, create a pipeline, change cultures while you're there, people who benefit think it's worth it. The other thing I'll note is that we often talk about stigma for athletes of color or students of color, but no one's talking about stigma for white coaches. Joe Judge getting a head coaching job, even though he has no head coaching experience, is a form of affirmative action. And no one says he should be embarrassed that he got that job because he reminded the owner of himself. Right, and so there's an interesting asymmetry here where we talk about stigma and thinking about, there's a lot of places where we could assign stigma. We tend to focus on the players or the coaches, and that tells us something about whether it's actually the policy that's causing the stigma or whether the stigma is going to attach to the coaches. Right? Maybe we should just ignore that and keep going.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. If I could just say one thing, it's an interesting point you make, because you're right. It's throughout, it's higher education, it's everywhere else. I mean, no matter what I do as an author, as a scholar, as a teacher, I feel there are going to be people out there who feel like I am where I am because I got some sort of a hand up. And so there really is no escaping it. And I think a lot of, there's an old adage in Black America, you work twice as hard to get half as much. And so I think a lot of people say, I'm gonna have to work twice as hard anyway, since I've been deprived opportunity, let me now have opportunity in whatever form it comes, and then let me seize it. And as you said, Associate Dean James, once I'm through the door, I'll show you that I should never go back out through the door. I belong to be in the room.
One last point, I think we've all made our points, but it's just a point of interest, and Jeremy knows this well, is Tom Williamson, who worked in the Clinton cabinet, was the first African-American partner at, what's the big firm in DC?
Covington.
He was one of the key advisors on the rule, and he was the person that pushed through the idea that I don't want to say pushed through, but the idea that there was a lot of conversation that there were going to be sham interviews. And my father was, as the white guy who had done some good things, but still is sort of the white guy, said, we can't ever have sham interviews. And it was Tom Williamson said, you're going to have sham interviews, Dan. You have to get something done. And so it was exactly this conversation that happened 20 years ago now. And again, we can go either way. There's a lot of criticism of the sham interviews, and Tom Williamson is one of the most brilliant people I'd ever known, and really had a big influence on my father in getting this through. But he had to decide that you would maybe think Dan Rooney would have taken, and it would have been vice versa. But your point is so on, so. it happened then as well.
That's right. That's right. So I have, this is actually, I think, a tough question. It's a question with which I struggle myself, which is, what is the difference between diversity and justice? And so the idea that we might encourage owners to do this because it's good for their bottom line, right? But what happens if a study comes out tomorrow and says, actually, the teams with all the same leadership do better? Do we jettison diversity because it's not working for us? And so how do we think, and that's a bigger question about how you change people's orientations to what is fair. And it overlaps with, I think, a critique of the NFL, which is, this is an organization that's working for wealthy white men, and the people on the line are Black people, right? Some of whom have less access to the sort of wealth. And so how do we square that all away, right? The idea that there are these dynamics about access and power, that some of this is about what is fair, and that maybe diversity gets us something, but it doesn't get us something that's lasting.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things. I think that so the access and power piece, the optics are unmistakable throughout professional sport and collegiate sport for that matter, which is that the Black bodies are toiling, and as a general matter are not reaping the greatest benefits, and certainly with the revenue producing sports in college, and so with respect to access and power. We had this moment this summer that's been alluded to, but we haven't articulated exactly what happened. But when professional athletes refused to play, beginning with the Milwaukee Bucks, followed by other NBA players, followed by the WNBA players, followed by some NHL teams and Major League Soccer teams, Major League Baseball teams, Naomi Osaka and others. When that happened, that was the most substantial activist moment in American sports, maybe since the 1968 Olympic Games with John Carlos and Tommy Smith. And some might say because so many people were involved, maybe even it was more impactful. So and of course, now we're back to what the Major League Baseball playoffs are going on, the NHL Stanley Cup just finished. So we're back to sports now. But it's unmistakable that in that moment, these individuals made clear that this industry they are indispensable to it. They are necessary to the industry. And if they refuse to participate, it will not go forward. And in making that clear, they forced people to look at them as humans, as individuals, and not commodities. And so there is an access issue. There is a power issue. But I think that, one stone has been thrown into the pool with that moment, and the toothpaste doesn't go back in the tube. That everybody in the power broking positions in sport knows that is possible and could happen again. So I think that's an important point that you made. The other one, with respect to justice and diversity, the opportunity should be given because it should be given. It shouldn't be given because it benefits the bottom line. And to me, I spend a lot of time concerned about the bottom line argument, because I feel like you shouldn't have to tell someone that's going to benefit you. That's almost insulting. It shouldn't have to benefit you. It should benefit those who are being disenfranchised. And the problem is that there just isn't consensus around it being right to give people a real opportunity. And so this is one of those situations where we've all discussed in various realms of the law, you make arguments in the alternative and you seek interest convergence. And so it's a long way of saying, if it turned out that some study came out, which I think would have to be wrong, because I just don't think that's the way the world works and humanity works. But if some study came out that said, homogeneity results in, the best outcomes, then that doesn't destroy the argument that there is something good and necessary about diversity, about inclusion, about equal opportunity, when it's simply right.
So we're at a law school and there's a Mansfield rule, right? I think so some firms adopt it. You have to have, I think, 30% of the pool for leadership and governance positions be people of color. Not all firms follow it, but it's out there. It's modeled after something like the Rooney Rule. And so I'm interested in what your thoughts would be about what is happening in the NFL, how the Rooney Rule operates, how those two things, what those two things should tell us about application to other contexts, to college athletics, to corporate contexts. I know Oregon has a public law that colleges and universities have to interview at least one qualified minority candidate, but no other state has adopted it. So talk to me about how you think these concepts that you're playing with or advancing in the NFL transfer to other parts of our society.
So, well, Jeremi can speak to the legal side because we talk about this often, and you know, where there are jobs that you know, legally you can't have a quota system. What are you going to do? And so, you know, the diverse slate is certainly an important part of that process. I think goal setting is good. I gotta say, my father didn't like goal setting because he felt that corporations set goals all the time, and it was a PR strategy more than it was a goal. And so he didn't like that because he felt that, you know, if people had a primrose path, they would use the primrose path. That you know, if you actually put people in situations where they had to review their conscience, that he believed that they would come out on top. He's been proven wrong, I think, in the last 10 years with the Rooney Rule. In the first 10 years, when he was sort of playing held the mirror of that conscience, he was more effective. So, you know, leadership is certainly a really important part of this. And you know, I think that there has to be this embodiment of the belief. And you know, I'm this white guy saying this. I get it, and I get that can be a really shallow place to be. But I saw this white guy do it, and it worked. And if you don't embody it, if you don't have emotional intelligence, you know, I don't have a great answer. I don't have a great solution that I can tell you that I believe that, you know, people that are only interested in money are going to make this decision if there's not a benefit to them. So, you know, I think I don't, you know, Jeremi, I have this conversation on and off the air many times. You know, I want to believe that he's right, but evidence of white people in power shows me that most of them don't act like my father. Now, the thing that I preach about my father, and again, it's an odd thing because I'm trying to be objective and I'm his son, but he died with more money, more fame, more success. All of the metrics that white people are looking for, he had more of them. And he did it by not just creating diversity, but in every one of these cases, the Rooney Rule, the Steelers, you know, he was a proactive advocate of Black men taking power. And it changed the systems that he was part of. The third big system was Ireland, where it was Catholics and Protestants. And I don't want to waste our time here on that, but there were just so many similarities, and he goes into that system. And now in that case, it was more philanthropy. He was raising more money, but he made sure the money was delivered to integrated education, integrated workforce development. And so, you know, I have this struggle because I totally want to believe Jeremi's argument, but the evidence is an individual. It's an individual with a whole bunch of data, but it becomes an anecdote because it is the exception rather than the rule in so many cases that I have seen. And again, there's plenty of white people that have done a lot more than Dan Rooney, and he's not the only person that's ever done it, but it's such a clear-cut case that I'm able to articulate. But the more I articulate it, the more challenging it becomes because it becomes more of an isolated case.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I'll say, I don't know, Jim, that you're more I've got my pessimism too. I'm not suggesting that, that we found the panacea here at all. But and so I think we're on the same wavelength there. But I think we have to explore. I think we have to explore the interest convergence argument for the reasons that we stated. But to get back to your question, Associate Dean James, about these other institutions, the sports, the law firms, and corporate America, you mentioned the state of Oregon. I think the things to take are from the NFL's experience. The NFL was first out of the gate, had success, and has had failures. And I think that it's important for these other organizations to learn from those. One is the point Jim made about leadership. There has to be desire high up in the organization for diversity and equity and inclusion. And if it's not there, then no equal opportunity initiative, Rooney Rule or otherwise, is going to be successful. So that's one. Two, you've got to have enforcement. That's where I think the league has really let us down in the last couple of years. There's not been the sort of enforcement. I think it's led to backsliding. And three, to me, the most important thing is I want for these other organizations to have other arrows in the quiver. I think that's something the NFL has lacked. And so the Rooney Rule had such success early on. I think the NFL relied on it some and wasn't consistently creative about other approaches. So I would say that these other organizations, whether they be states or municipalities or governmental agencies or private industry, that they not rely just on this initiative. I think it's a valuable initiative, but it's got to be paired with other initiatives if we're going to see success.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I want to give our audience members an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have a question, we already have a couple in the queue, but if you have questions, please go ahead and ask in the Q&A feature, and we'll bring you up one by one. Our first person to ask is Jay Pinkney Cabal.
You're on mute.
Hello?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. I guess my question is that if the NCAA or the individual conferences adopted a similar rule to the Rooney Rule, would this show in the numbers of the NFL? I don't know if there's anything that would show.
If I understand your question, would it reflect? Would it impact the NFL's diversity numbers? So I think the answer is possibly. When NFL clubs are looking for head coaches, generally they look at offensive and defensive coordinators, but also college head coaches. And so if you have more diversity in the high ranks of college coaches, then maybe it'll trickle up. I can say that the Fritz Pollard Alliance, this outside advocacy group that's been pushing the NFL with respect to diversity, has pushed very hard for the NCAA to adopt a form of the Rooney Rule, and the NCAA has refused over the course of the last decade. That'd be a whole nother conversation as to whether I think that's a legitimate refusal. I think that the NCAA could push forward a Rooney Rule, but they've not done it. But one conference has, and they just did it, the West Coast Conference, where Bill Russell played when he was in college, a basketball player, and they call it the Russell Rule. And so they've instituted that rule. And as dominoes tend to fall, other conferences are contemplating instituting the rule. So we may, Jay, end up with a nice case study to see if that rule is instituted, if we see greater numbers of head coaches of color in the football ranks in the NCAA world, if we see the trickle up to the pro side. Is to be determined, I think.
The next questioner is from one of my students, Michael Maturo. I'm delighted to see him. Go ahead, Michael.
Hi. One thing that I found interesting was how Black players comprise about 8 to 10% of MLB players. And there are 3 Black head coaches out of 30 teams. So 10% of coaches, 10% of players. In the NFL, it's roughly 68 to 70% of Black players. And there's 3 Black head coaches out of 32 teams. So I was just wondering why the demographics of the players aren't translating to the head coaching jobs in the NFL. Whereas I know it's a small sample, only 3 out of 30, but like they are in the MLB or other sports.
Great question.
So, I mean, look, the fact of the matter is the trend in the NFL is going away from players as such a true pipeline, or at least NFL players. And I think that goes to Jeremy's point. I think it's really important that, we start working with colleges and even colleges that might be smaller than University of Miami, the Big Five type of conference teams. Although we have to move up to that. But I think that coaching has become such a distinctive skill set that a lot of folks are starting, that path at 19, 20 years old, where they become an assistant within the university, work their way up onto the staff as a graduate assistant, and then that's where the jobs come from. So in those pools, the NFL has done some things, but I would say we're not a whole lot better off than where we are on the more traditional pool, and that has to happen. There's a whole host of ideas there, but we have to sort of reckon with that fact, because I don't know that I think the disparity is a legitimate question, but it's not going to be a one-to-one answer. There is this disparity between on-field and decision-making, but the answer to it is not necessarily that we start coaching our players to become coaches. It's that we see the benefits on a whole host of levels that allow would allow to build this pipeline from I guess I could call it a more grassroots endeavor or source.
Jeremy, did you have something you want to say?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say that it's a great question you ask, and one thing that we have to contend with and accept is that there's also, in addition to everything we've said, there is some just racism that exists, and it exists among people, that exists among some NFL owners and some MLB owners and some NBA owners, and the age-old stereotypes that have existed since the days of enslaved people in this country about Black people not having the leadership ability or not being smart enough, still exist in some minds, whether consciously or subconsciously. And what's interesting is, as we've moved toward people of color entering coaching in the professional ranks, you saw in the modern Major League Baseball, you saw Frank Robinson was the first manager in 1975, Black manager of an MLB team. Bill Russell, the first head coach, 1966. And in the modern day NFL, we didn't have a Black head coach until 1989. And a lot of sports sociologists say that, while these owners have found that perhaps a 5-person starting NBA team, a 12-person roster, a 25-person MLB roster, with 9 on the field, maybe a Black person could handle those. There's been some sentiment that, the NFL team with 53 on the roster, you got 11 starting, you've got all sorts of formations and plays and sets. Maybe a Black person doesn't quite have what it takes there. And so that's something that's without question driven the delays, I'll say, in head coaching opportunities for Black folks in the NFL historically. And I wouldn't be surprised if it still, sadly, lives in the minds of some of the decision makers in the league.
Yeah, I think I might follow up and ask about cultural differences in football versus baseball versus basketball. That is, I think, the NBA has sort of built an entire brand around a much more progressive, youthful culture. And the NFL, I think, is a much more traditional model. And sometimes that comes with retrograde values. And so I wonder if that also has something to do, sort of the power structures are more deeply ingrained to maintain hierarchies of power in the NFL in a way that might not be in an NBA or the Major League Baseball.
Well, and I think there's a good point, because the reality is that the impact that football has on the Black community, if we don't look, if we look at quantifiable measures, is much bigger than basketball. There are more Black kids go to college on football scholarships. There's more Black coaches at the high school level, at the college level, and at the professional level. So you have a much greater impact numerically or empirically from football. But it's such a good question to ask about culture. Why isn't there more decision making down to the high school level? And I think Jeremi hits it on the head, and I probably should have said it, but I'm so glad he did. I think a lot of it comes back to the quarterback and the fact that for so many years there was bias against Black quarterbacks. And just as we're talking about that is a decision. It is probably the decision-making capability of any athlete is probably done by the quarterback more than any other position in any sport. And there has been this horrific bias. And so I think that has an impact in the cultural question, as you asked, and it's even more sort of difficult to watch when you look at the total numbers, because the numbers in football are larger than basketball or any other sport in terms of the impact.
Right. We have another question from Renae Myles Payne. Go ahead, Renae.
Yes. So hi, thank you guys for being here tonight. So how do we dismantle or infiltrate those networks that keep people of color from reaching those levels of decision-making positions?
Good question.
Renae, that's the money question right there. I mean, you hit it on the head, and the idea behind the Rooney Rule tweak this spring to expand it to the business side and ultimately to the president of a football club goes in that direction. Perhaps more to the point is ownership. How do we move toward more Black sports ownership in professional leagues? And the barriers to entry are extremely high. Let's take the NFL, for example. The last club sold, the Carolina Panthers sold for $2.4 billion, I think. And I think under the NFL rules, a general partner, so not a group of potential owners, but the general partner, the key person, has to have a third of that amount roughly in liquid, not in stocks, not leverage, but in liquid. So we're talking about a Black person who has $800 million. And because of the systemic discrimination that has existed, since the enslaved people came to this country, the number of people who have even had the opportunity to get close to $800 million who are Black is minuscule. And so we've got to find ways to build the economic power base to get into ownership. We've got to find ways other than the Rooney Rule concept to get Black people up to the president positions and decision-making positions. I want your oar in the water also on this, Renae. I mean, all of us have to think about how we do that, because it's a tough nut to crack. But once we're able to do that, then I think we're going to see the world we'd like to see, where there is true opportunity for people of color in the sports business.
The other answer, Renae, is, and I'm getting in a little trouble for saying this, but vote with your feet. If a large portion of the audience doesn't show up, NBC, ABC, CBS are going to say to the NFL, look, you are our biggest investment, and we are the biggest investment for the largest television networks in America. There is power in your decisions and in choices like that. Those are things that I think folks have to think about as well, is what do we all tolerate in terms of consumption and the impact that has on what the managers, the decision makers, the leaders, the folks in power with those organizations. Because I'm going back to Jeremi's remark earlier. Most of the people in power that I know, if you start threatening their money, they'll make different decisions.
So this has been such a wonderful conversation, and it's only the tip of the iceberg. You just got into sort of patterns of consumption, which is a huge piece of this. It only survives based on the people who are consuming football. We didn't talk about gender. We largely talked about a white, black binary, right? But there are other minority groups in the NFL, and so there's so much more to discuss. I encourage you, if you attended today and liked what you heard and appreciate the conversation, to follow our panelists. Their information has been placed in the chat for you. And I just want to thank you, Jeremi and Jim, for spending time with us today, for giving us some of your knowledge and for helping us to think more deeply about this issue, not just in the context of athletics, but in American society moreover. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really
I want
wonderful.
to thank Dean James for taking the time for moderating this. Just a wonderful job as always. We really appreciate it. And also I want to give a special thanks to Jordan Gary, one of our 2L students, JD LLM honor student, who helped with the preparation of some of the research and questions for this. So
Thank you. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say how lucky you all are to have Dean Varona. We want him back. We understand that he's happy there. We know he's doing a wonderful job, but it's a big loss for us. And you all are very, very fortunate to have him down there.
Can't have him. It's a nice choice.
have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.